Good to see you this morning. You guys glad to be here? Yeah. All right. I am. You know, I'm going to begin this morning in what I think is a pretty exciting message series. Have you guys noticed I don't ever use the word sermon? You guys ever noticed that? Yeah, it's like, I don't really like that word. Okay, there's nothing wrong with it. I just don't like it. So it's a message series, all right? And here's what we're going to do the next several weeks. I'm going to be pulling some things out of the Sermon on the Mount, okay? And in case you don't know this, if you're a little bit new to all this Christianity thing, the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And if you go through there, guys, here's what, you're going to read some things. You're going to see where Jesus talks about worry. I mean, we've all worried about things, haven't we? And Jesus talks about worry. We're going to go through there and we're going to look at what he says about faith, because sometimes our faith is shaken a little bit. Sometimes it's like, man, I don't know if I have faith. Where is my faith? And so we're going to be talking about that a little bit. You know, Jesus even grinds it down like, you know, does the Bible really talk about these things? And Jesus talks about adultery. He talks about promiscuity. He talks about all kinds of things in the Sermon on the Mount. It's 3 chapters of Matthew's gospel. And believe it or not, no matter what topic Jesus talked on, it drew a pretty big crowd, okay? So he was talking to a lot of people. And we're going to be looking at these things. And what I'm going to begin today is we're going to talk about how do we live this out, all right? You know, Jesus has called me to be one of his followers. And so how do I live this out? How do I make this work in my life? And so we're going to be looking at that the next few weeks. I'm not going to give you any idea beforehand what I'm going to be speaking on, okay? So you come and you hear it all, and then, you know, we're just going to see how God leads and works in that. But, you know, if you've ever had enemies or you've ever had people that you've had conflict with, you know, Jesus talks about that in Matthew chapter, you know, in the Sermon on the Mount. He deals with those things, and even healing. You know, I'm going to talk a little bit about healing in one of those messages. So you're going to want to hear this, all right? But before that, you know, when you go prior or when you precede Matthew chapter 5, you look in chapter 4. We're going to begin there today because Jesus, he's calling his disciples, okay? Now, guys, oftentimes when we look at this stuff in the Bible, you know what we do? We look at this like it's historical stuff, which it is, but it also relates today in the 21st century, okay? Everything the Bible says relates to you right now today, in your culture, in your language, in all that you are. It relates to you today. But we look at it sometimes historically. We look at it sometimes academically. I know when I was like going through Bible college, seminary, and all that jazz, it was real hard. You know, when you're looking at it academically, it's like I kept wanting to pull that back into reality, pull it, you know, take the historical part of it or take the academic part, but I want to know, how does that fit in my life, you know? I don't want to just regurgitate or repeat some information. I want to know how that works in my life. And I think that's what Jesus was all about, is showing us how his teachings worked in our lives. So we're going to look at this calling. And I want every one of you this morning, and those who will be here next year or next week, you're not here this week, whatever, but I want you to look at the fact that Jesus has called you, okay? He's calling you. And whether you've ever felt that call or you've sensed that call in your life, he's calling you. He's constantly calling us. But we're going to move this away. This is not a place or a vocation or anything like that at this point. He's calling everyone with the same calling that he called his first disciples. So let's go to Matthew chapter 4 real quick, and let's look at verse 18. You've probably read this at least once, but we're going to look at how Jesus called and where he called these first disciples, okay? As Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter, which you guys know that, don't you? Simon and Peter are the same guy, okay? You know, the rock guy, Simon, okay? Peter, okay, it's that guy. And his brother Andrew, and they were casting a net into the lake. Why? Because they were fishers, okay? So here's the deal. These guys were going about their everyday business, just doing their job, never really thought anything spectacular or different would happen that day. And then Jesus is just I kind of picture him casually walking by the Sea of Galilee, okay? I can kind of see Jesus just walking along the shore, maybe looking at some seashells, maybe feeling the spray of the sea, smelling the salt of the sea. And then all of a sudden he sees these guys, Peter and Andrew, and it's like, hey, you know what? Maybe those guys would make good disciples. I don't know. Let's find out. And so he calls them, and then we'll look at what their response was in just a few moments, okay? But here we've got these guys, and listen now, here's the disciples, okay? They were well established. These guys were already well established in their careers, okay? I mean, this calling that Jesus gives them is not a vocational calling. So I want you to put that aside today, okay? That is part of what God does. He calls us to vocations. He equips us. You know, we educate ourselves for certain things. We get experiences. All of that's a part of it. But we're going to carve that out today, and we're going to look at it in the context of calling us just to follow. And so even though these guys were, well established in their career, they had vocations, they were going about their everyday business here on the Sea of Galilee, again, not thinking really anything different was going to happen. And, all of a sudden, Jesus gives them this call. Now, listen, guys, when you read that, there's really no explanation why he calls these two guys. Have you noticed that? And I want you to think about this, too. Everything that you see in God's Word, sometimes it's like, well, why didn't God say this? Why didn't he say that? You know why? It didn't matter. That's why. And so Jesus is calling out these guys, all right? And there's really no explanation why he calls Peter or why he calls Andrew at this point. Now, later on, you know what we learn about these guys later on? We sort of learn as we unpack their lives a little bit that these guys really didn't have much to offer. And that's how some people look at their lives when they feel like they want to follow Jesus or do something for God. It's like, I don't really have anything to offer, and why would God want me? And I'm really nobody. And sometimes we have this false humility or this modesty. And God calls us all on the same level that we're going to look at today. But these guys had nothing to really offer. They had a vocation. They were people just like you and I. They were just regular people. They actually, if you look at these guys' lives, you know what they were? They were kind of C students. C students. Normal. Now, you may not know this, but in studying people and profiles and personalities over the years, you guys may not know this, but statistically, the most successful people in America, anyway, are C students. You may not know that. They really are. The most successful people in America are C students, the average. And these guys were just C students. They were normal guys. If you want a little bit of a description of their life, these guys would be, I think these guys would be perfect for today's reality TV. I do. I think maybe they could have their own show called maybe Greatest Catch, okay? Or Discipleship Dynasty or something like that. Because they were big, brawny, just regular guys, uneducated, unlearned, unexperienced, had nothing to offer. Actually, some of them actually used language and cursed and did all these things that church people don't do, right? Church people don't do those things, do they? And so it's like, why would he call these guys? But he does. Being called into something that Christ calls us into, this calling we're looking at today, really requires absolutely no experience whatsoever, just like these guys had none. It didn't matter to Jesus where they'd come from or what they were or even what they believed at this point. He was taking them from where they were, and he was moving them with this calling into a life that was something totally different. It was a call to follow. And I like the simplicity that Matthew and Mark uses this too in chapter 1, where Jesus just simply calls and these guys follow. Some of your translations will use the word they straightway. I think King James uses straightway, which means immediately. And so the idea both Matthew and Mark gives us is that when Jesus called, these guys were like, hey man, let's go follow. I mean, they didn't even think about it, didn't pray about it or anything. And so they just began to follow, okay? That's all they really get at this point. It's just, the call to follow. Jesus reaches out to them verbally and says, guys, I want you to follow me. And that's really all they get at this point. No explanation, no details, no guidelines, no resume, no job description, none of that stuff. And so that's where it starts with everybody. You see, I think that's one of the biggest ways we can relate today. The call that Jesus gives these disciples on the Sea of Galilee over 2,000 years ago is the same call that he gives everyone today. It starts there, the simple call to follow. That's where it starts. But let's grind it a little deeper, guys, okay? Let's go a little further with this. And I want to begin here with the reality, a call to real life. In Matthew 4:19, Jesus says, "Come and follow me." Now there again, that's that simple phrase, a simple sentence, a simple calling. Come and follow me. And I want to believe in my heart that he's calling them to real life. You see, they had a life, they had a job, they had a vocation, probably had a savings account, probably well known in the community as good fishermen. But Jesus is like, man, I'm calling you to something different. I'm calling you to real life. Now, guys, listen, I think there's a life and then there's real life. And I think when we begin following Jesus Christ, if we really want to, we can begin to experience this real life that God offers through him. This real life that Christ died for on the cross. Something different, better than just the normality that most people live. So what is that? I mean, real life. Well, he says, come and follow me. And Jesus didn't say anything else at that point, but he was going to describe to them what real life was. Okay? And I want you to go back to what I said earlier in the message this morning, and that is when we start unpacking all of the things in the Sermon on the Mount, you know what you and I are going to find out? We're going to find out that's what real life is. And Jesus not just says, hey, come follow, I'll show you real life, and then moves on. He's going to He describes to them what that is, okay? And so I don't want to leave you with this message today, just, hey, come follow. We're going to take the next few weeks and we're going to see, what does that really mean? If Jesus is really calling me to real life, what is real life? What does it look like? How do I live it out, okay? Guys, I want you to watch this real quick, okay? And before we watch this little video clip, you've probably all seen this movie. And I want you to focus on this movie, and I want you to just listen to this real. Give us some good volume, Joe, if you will, so everybody can hear. Maybe if it has subtitles, I don't know if it does or not. But I want you to capture this, because in this movie is one of the greatest scenes about making a choice, okay? And this sort of represents kind of the choice like Jesus gives us when he says, come and follow.
The matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
I love that. I think that's really good. You know, Jesus said, all I'm offering you is the truth. And then we get the choice. It's not really the red pill or the blue pill. Those kind of look like Mike and Ike's, don't they? Not really the red pill or the blue pill, but it's something, you know, it's a choice that we make. We can live life the way we're living it now, or we can make a choice to live a totally different life. And that's what he was saying. When you come and follow me, that you're making a choice to live a totally different kind of life. And that's the option Jesus gave his disciples, and the same one he gives us. I think it's kind of like that. You see, Jesus is still searching for people to follow. Even this morning in this room, Jesus is searching for people that want to follow, just like he did on the Sea of Galilee. And those guys really give us a reminder of what that's like. You know, guys, I read a story a few years ago about a guy named Kim. He was a young Chinese student. And he was one of the Chinese students that was protesting in Tiananmen Square back in 1989. Anybody know about that or remember that at all? Anybody in this room? Okay, a few of you. All right. Well, this guy Kim and his friend were in Tiananmen Square. And if you know anything about it, they were protesting against communism. And what these guys had done is they had taken their hands and they'd cut their hands, and they were wearing headbands. And they cut their hands and they used the blood up from their hands, and they wrote something on their headbands. Kim wrote freedom on his headband, and his friend wrote democracy on his head. And remember, they were protesting against communism. And then the military had brought tanks in Tiananmen Square, all right? And I remember vividly in 1989 watching this on television and watching those military tanks come into Tiananmen Square. And those students were standing there in front of those tanks. I remember that like it was yesterday, seeing that on television. And these guys, these students, all of a sudden Kim, the one student, he saw this elderly lady come out, and he didn't know what she was doing at first, but she came out with some bread and some water because the soldiers had been out there for like a long time, and they were getting thirsty and hungry. And so this lady, she was a professor at one of the universities, and she brought this water and this bread out, and she was giving it to the soldiers because they'd been out there so long, and he was pretty upset about it. He realized, though, that what he was watching, this professor was a Christian, and he was watching this lady give something to these soldiers. And he didn't understand it at the moment, but that was the first time he'd seen Christianity in action. And at that point in Kim's life, he said, man, he really thought it was kind of stupid, to be honest with you. He thought Christianity was dumb. He thought it was just some American thing at that point in his life. Well, later, the same guy, Kim, was working on his master's degree. And during those studies, he was invited by a friend to a small group study on the book of John, the Gospel of John. And Kim went through that Bible study with some friends of his and some other students. And through the process of going through that study and learning about Jesus and learning about the call that Christ puts on our lives, Kim received Jesus into his heart. He became a Christian, a follower of Jesus. And from that point on, even today, I think even right now, he's still in China sharing that same gospel with other people so that when they hear that call, they can follow Christ just like he did, that his life was changed and he began to experience real life. And that's what he said. When I followed the call that Christ gave me, I began to experience the real life that so many other people had talked about. Let's go back to these disciples for a moment. These guys were really not any different than you are. They were just men doing what they do every day of their lives, except for this. Jesus called them, and it was a call to follow. And at that moment, they left with a choice, with making a choice. They chose and made the choice to follow. The second thing we look at this morning, guys, is what I want to call the dichotomy of choice. Let's look at Matthew once again, next verse 20. Now remember, Jesus, he's walking by the Sea of Galilee. He sees these two guys, Simon, Andrew, nothing really to brag about, not attractive, not really, nobody would really pay much attention to him. But he sees them and calls them. They follow. At once, immediately, they left their nets and followed him. Now, you know what? I've read that 1,000,000 times. And to me, it's almost like there seems like there should be something in between. There should be something between come and follow and actually follow. Because that's the way it is with most of us, you know it? It's like we hear the call and it's like, let me think about it. Let me process it. Let me pray about it. Let me get some advice, okay? we sort of do that, don't we? But these disciples, I mean, there was something that happened that day and they immediately just start following Jesus. That's all that Mark or John, either one, tells us, is that they left their nets and started following him. Now, guys, to the average person, it kind of seems like maybe Jesus put some spell on these guys, you know, come follow me. And they start following without any choice at all, like some zombies or something, okay? Without a mind of their own. It almost seems that way, doesn't it? But that's not what really happened. I think we can plainly see that they made a choice. How do we know that? It says that they left their nets and followed. And I think it just plainly tells us there that they made a choice. You see, every one of us, every time God gets involved in our lives, guys, we have this dichotomy of choice going on. We can choose to follow or not follow. We can choose to listen or not listen. We can choose to obey, to give, whatever it might be, or not do that. You see, God doesn't just, you know, put some spell on us that we follow him automatically. He loves us enough to give us free will, free choice. And so we get to choose. And these guys chose. And what we're talking about today is for you and I to make, you know, to think about making those same choices. I don't know if you know what a dichotomy is. When you have a whole, okay? All of us, we are all a whole, okay? We're a whole. And a dichotomy is when you take that and you make two parts from a whole, all right? And our choices are that way, okay? They sort of, a dichotomy is sort of splitting that into two things. When we have that freedom to make a choice, we can choose to do something or not to do something. Now, if you're anything like me, guys, sometimes I think we have too many choices. You guys ever think that, too many choices? I mean, I'm not dumb or anything like that, but sometimes I look at some of the choices, all these choices we have today, and it's like, man, I don't need all those choices, especially coffee. How many coffee drinkers we got in here today? Any coffee drinkers? Okay, there better be more than me, okay, because I've watched some of you drink coffee, all right? So we got a lot of coffee drinkers in here today. And have you ever noticed just the choices of coffee today? I mean, for crying out loud. I go to Starbucks and I look at the board. You see, I'm just this kind of guy. I'm just a black coffee kind of guy. That's really all I need. I don't need lattes and all this other stuff. I don't need 375 ways to drink coffee. All I need is some Java, okay? Some Joe, all right? Some caffeine. And I sometimes get a little confused when I go to Starbucks and look at the board up there with all these choices. And I'm like, latte, this. You know what? The only thing I know about a latte is that they cost a latte. That's all I know about a latte. They cost a latte, okay? That's all I know. I just need black coffee. But we have all these choices today, okay? Jesus comes to us with these simple choices. Not this barrage of things that we can't even understand, but just a simple choice. And he says, follow. Hey, man, that's all I'm asking you to do is just follow me right now. I'll bring the rest of the details in later. And so he was drawing this sharp contrast here. All right? Now, what he sees in, you know, as you follow this verse down, and you can look at it for yourself, he doesn't just leave it open-ended. Come and follow me, he said, and then he says, I'm going to make you fishers of men. Now, I think they pretty much, they had some concept of what he could have been talking about here, because they were fishers of fish already. And so he said, I'm going to make you fishers of men. So he was drawing this contrast, a sharp contrast between fishers of men and fishers of fish. Okay, that's a big deal, big difference. And sometimes, you know, when the Lord calls us, he makes these sharp contrasts in our lives. You see, they had the choice of they could keep doing what they were doing, guys, or they could follow him and experience and live out something totally different. You see, when God, this call that we're talking about today is not really a vocational calling. It's not really an educational calling, a financial calling. It's a spiritual calling. And that's the same call that everyone gets. Everybody's across the board gets the same calling, a call to follow. In this call, Jesus is drawing a sharp contrast. And listen, here's how this works. Whenever he calls us into this spiritual realm, this real life living, we have the choice to follow or not. And if we decide to take the red pill and follow, then we get to see how far this goes. You see, Christ calls us into a world of sharp contrasts. What does that mean? It's a sharp contrast between the other world. You see, when we really become a Christ follower, that is a sharp contrast to this world. And we're not talking about pious acts of religiosity. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about church going. That's not it either. It's a spiritual dimension that we can never have until we choose to follow. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. We have this dichotomy of choice to choose or not to choose. Guys, you know how choices work as well as I do. You know, it's like to be or not to be. You come up to an intersection and the light turns yellow. Have you ever wondered, do I stop, do I go? Do I stop, do I go? You ever wondered that? Yeah. You know, you go up to a food buffet, fruit or sweets, carbs or protein, okay? You know, we have all these choices, don't we? And so the choice to follow Jesus is that same way. And it's a sharp contrast. And I can only, for me, here's how it works for me, guys, okay? And you can sort it out for yourself. Ask God to help you. I don't live a perfect life. I still make mistakes. I still have flaws. Look at me. Guys, look. I am a flawed person, okay? But I want to make this work in my life. And I want to live a sharp contrast to what's normal, to what culture tells me to live. Because I made a choice many years ago to live a different life, to follow Christ. It's a sharp contrast. Here's a story real quick about two guys. It's a little simple, maybe a little bit, it's simple. Two guys, one guy's name was Josh, the other guy's name was Daniel. And these two guys were given a block of wood and a knife, okay? Now that's a dangerous thing. You give two guys a block of wood and a knife, you no telling what'll happen. But they were told to carve something out of that block of wood. And so Josh, he grabs his block of wood and he takes his knife, he opens it up, he starts carving away. I mean, chips are flying everywhere. And Daniel does the same thing. He gets his block of wood, he starts carving, you know, just chipping away at the wood. Well, Josh begins his chipping with a vision. He knows what his block of wood is supposed to look like. And so he starts carving away at that wood, trying to shape it and mold it and make it look like it's supposed to. And Daniel rather, is just carving away at that thing. He didn't know what to do. He had no vision. He was just carving away. Well, at the end, you know what? Josh's block of wood turns into a boat. Daniel's block of wood turns into sawdust. You see, what's the difference? What's the difference there, guys? See, Josh, this kid, and by the way, I'm not making this up, okay? Guys, I'm not making this up, all right? Josh started with a vision. He knew what he wanted his block of wood to look like, and he carved that away, and he molded it and shaped it because it's like, this is what and here's the real point. You see, he knew how to transition that block of wood from nothing but a square block of wood into something useful, a boat. He knew how to do that. Daniel didn't. Okay? And that's what was going on. It was a sharp contrast there between a block of wood and a boat. And sometimes that's what happens in our lives. We live life out. Guys, I can't tell you how many people I see in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, their 60s. And they've lived, they've breathed, they've eaten, they've worked jobs, they've earned paychecks. But they look back on their lives and it's like, man, there's been no real purpose, no real shape, no real direction. And there's a difference. You see, a guy named Larry Crabb put it this way: there's more to life than merely living. And that's what Jesus is calling us to something more than merely living. It's doing something more with life. It's following this call to experience all that Christ has designed you to experience. You know what he said to these guys? Fishers of men. They were never going to be fishers of men on their own. Never. It was only by following this call that was going to happen. There are things that God has planned and purposed for each of your lives this morning. Until or unless you follow that call, you will not experience those things. You may have a good life. You may earn a good living. You might live in a nice house. But you will miss the things God has for you. The deeper things, the eternal things, without following that call. Last thing we look at quickly this morning is this. It's not a thing, it's a lifestyle. You know, we often have this idea that following Jesus or having God in our life is all about blessing. It's all about getting stuff. You know, it's just my opinion based on what I've learned and what I think Scripture teaches. We have this idea that if God's blessed my life, then I'm going to have all these things. And that could be true. You know, we could have all these nice things if God blesses you. That's possible. But I believe it's more than that. You see, it's not, this whole call of Christ is not about a thing. It's about a lifestyle. How do I know that? That's why he unpacks it in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And we're going to look at that. You see, it's a lifestyle, not a thing. At this point, it's a lifestyle, not a place. Sometimes we think if we follow God, he's leading us to this place, this destination. And sometimes he does. But the more important thing is this. It's not about the destination. It's about the journey. Did you get that? It's what happens along the journey that matters, not the destination. Jesus was calling these guys on a journey. Morpheus was calling Neo on a journey. Jesus was calling Peter and Andrew on a journey, and he's calling you and I on that same journey. Ask yourself this question. Now, and guys, I really want you to ask this. This is not just verbiage or words. Don't check out on me just yet, okay? Ask yourself this question. Do I follow Jesus for this thing? Do I follow him for this thing? Whatever, and you fill in the blank what that thing is. Or do I follow him because of the lifestyle that he wants me to live and just the awesome blessings of that lifestyle? You know, when we get started and go through the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to be investigating the things Jesus talked about that dealt with the reality of lives. And guys, listen, I am totally convinced, and I've shared this with some of our leaders here and people outside of this church as well. I think we live in somewhat of a biblically illiterate culture today. I do. And now what do I mean by that? I think we have huge churches today. We do. We have lots of people that know very little about the Bible or about God. And so next few weeks, we're going to look at some of the stories that maybe people are missing, or some of the things maybe we haven't touched on for a while. But Jesus talks about the reality of our daily lives. And again, I mentioned these things earlier, like, what do you do when you worry, guys? What do you do when you pray? How do you pray? What are you asking for? What about this one? What about finding your way through life? What do you do with that? And then how do I handle conflict, people, sexual things? Jesus covers it all. Why? Why does he do that? It's because he's calling us to a lifestyle that is different than our culture. And guys, if you understand this movie, The Matrix, so many of God's people get sucked into the Matrix, the culture. And he calls us out of that culture. And that's what we're going to look at. These guys wanted to follow Jesus. And sometimes he does call us to a place. He might be calling you to a place right now. But in this context today, he's calling us to a life. The place will follow. All the other things will come about. But it's the lifestyle that we start with. Some of you remember this. You know, it's kind of neat when I say things and people repeat them back to me. I love that. You know why? Not because I have to be heard again. It's because you get it. Remember this? It's not easy, but it is what? All right, 3 of you know that. Okay. It's not easy, but it is simple, okay? I'm going to give you a new word today I want you to learn, okay? Here it is. Ready? Unlearn. The word unlearn. You see, I want you to unlearn some things. Because I think when we follow Christ, we have to unlearn some things. And we'll look at that in the next few chapters. The things that are mentioned in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, guys, are the what would Jesus do things. WWJD. What would Jesus do? I've been in situations a couple times and people say, what would Jesus do? You know what my answer is? I don't know. I'm not Jesus. Sometimes I don't know. But if I read and I study his word and I absorb that in my heart and my mind, I get a better understanding of it. I get a better idea of what he might do. And so that's what we're going to look at. What would Jesus do in these situations? You know, in the moments in my life when I've lost something, in the moments when things are out of control and I don't know what to do. You know, when I don't have enough money to do something, when my friends have betrayed me, when I feel left out, it could be a laundry list of things. What do I do? Well, I believe the Bible has an answer for every one of those things. And we're going to unpack some of that, okay, in the next few weeks. But today I want to ask you this as we close. And worship team, you can get ready to come if you'd like. Guys, I want to ask you, are you ready? And you don't, listen, you don't answer me, okay? You don't answer to me. You answer to God. Are you ready to start this lifestyle like Andrew and Peter, James and John? Are you ready to do that? Have you been processing that? Or maybe today for the very first time you're like, wow, no one ever asked me that before. And so maybe you're ready to start a different life, a new dimension. We want to help you with that. And so if you'll let us know in your own way, just let us know. I'd love to sit down and talk with you about that. Or maybe you're here this morning and you know Jesus. You've been saved. You've been baptized. Whatever, wherever you're at in your spiritual walk, and you're like, I'm ready to restart. Maybe I'm ready to restart my life with him. Maybe I'm ready now to walk into this new dimension, this red-pilled dimension. I don't know. You answered that today, though, as we sing and pray in the next moment. Just whatever the Holy Spirit leads you to do, just respond to him, okay? Jesus, we're not on the Sea of Galilee today. We're in a small church in Montgomery, Cincinnati, Ohio, USA. But you're here too. And just like you walked on the sea that day and you called those disciples, I believe with all my heart you're calling. Because you're always calling. And I want to ask you this morning, Lord, to help people. God, please just give them the courage, the faith to follow wherever they're at. And I pray in Jesus' name.